Thank you, Petra. Maybe Steve, because we discussed this morning and I discovered that you rapidly understood somewhat about the health industry in a short period of time. When you presented that, you pretended that you had very little knowledge about this industry, so maybe you can share with us some of your views.
With pleasure. And how do we get to the future is, I think, the question we want to end up with today. And what was interesting as a revelation this morning was that it appears that the issues of health globally aren't very well managed globally. They're managed, I mean, the multinational companies operate at global level and people operate internationally. But the international structures, alongside the WHO being the most prominent, there seems to be a gap or a vacuum there. So I start from that position. I did want to give you, I've worked more intensively on food security at the global level, on food and water security, also on energy and climate security. And I might come back to the climate parallel later on when we talk about process, because we've now had 3.5 years of working with China, with the Chinese, about getting to the point where they wanted to define and lead what they thought was important about the climate and sustainability agenda, which is now called their Green Growth Agenda, and it's just starting to emerge with the failure of the Durban talks and the Kyoto Protocol. When we come back to the health industry globally, and the point that was made by both of you in your very good presentations was about, if you're talking about global R&D and innovation and intellectual property and who benefits and who contributes, there's a real question there about what role the developing world plays, which is non-traditional. I just wanted to mention 3 things briefly. Bill Gates, I had the opportunity to host him in Melbourne in Australia 11 years ago. He gave his first public speech about the space he was moving into with his philanthropy and his contribution. The reason we did that is because one of my senior figures, an Australian medical scientist, badgered Bill Gates' father $50 million at a time until he got to $1 billion for what became Gavi, the Global Alliance on Vaccines and Immunisation. That was interesting because it was, it was celebrity alliance stuff. Traditionally, health seemed to have been much more, if you like, managed by government or intergovernmental processes. But this new move 10 years ago to have celebrity alliances like Gates and Buffett and others, quite spectacular. I wonder about some of the distortion that occurs as a consequence of that, and it's interesting about the policy-making space. Second issue to mention, although it's not deep for today, is that Australia is having a raging debate about tobacco legislation, about not banning tobacco but plain paper packaging, and this will be subject to court challenges, but it could well be a world-leading position one way or the other, quite profoundly. And it raises interesting questions about the right. Did I hear that the Viennese are just about to reintroduce smoking on...
They are considering reintroducing smoking on some carriages.
Yeah, so it's interesting juxtaposition. The third little health story I mentioned, it was only last week that I met the founder and CEO, who is an Australian, and he's moved back from Columbia University to Australia to run a $2 billion listed company, which apparently is the world's leading developer of clinical stage regenerative medicine based upon highly potent off-the-shelf adult stem cells. I hadn't made the connection between stem cell research and regenerative medicine turning into off-the-shelf products. And that was a kind of so I guess my point there is the health industry is a much faster moving and wider thing than I had expected. The question I'd raise, which is really where my expertise comes in, maybe, is about goals. It's very hard to understand what global health goals are and who sets them. You know, what is it we're actually shooting to achieve and who determines that? There are, of course, the Millennium Development Goals. But how does this fit within a wider framework of human security and international decision-making? And I raise the question because I don't know. And if I don't know, then I'm reasonably informed that I'd like to know. The second question is, how do you measure progress on these matters? And you mentioned the Global Reporting Initiative, which I think is very interesting. And there's another focus, because I wonder sometimes about compartmentalising issues. If we put health too much into its own box, it might turn off all those who aren't actually in the health sector. And I'm quite interested in the idea of human security and health being part of a human security agenda. And I've been involved, as our chief statistician in Australia and a number of statisticians around the world, with the OECD in a rolling project on measuring progress. In this case, it's measuring Australia's progress around a whole range of social criteria, which include health, not just economic and not just environmental criteria. This is a movement now at the global level, and the OECD is moving aggressively into this space to say, how do we measure what really matters in people's lives? That might be very helpful to helping to answer the question, or benchmarking and answer the question about what matters in global health collaboration, decision making. The final point I'd make in these opening remarks is that I'm interested in pathways to the future. So if it is about global health and it is about how do you design new models of cooperation, in food security, for example, and in these other agenda areas, we and others in my network are very involved with pushing the G20 towards being a leadership group on these issues rather than a management group. I missed half the global governance discussion this morning. Unfortunately, I had to be with, we were having our briefing. But this notion about saying that the G20 is really a reform or leadership group to help set an agenda or targets, to review progress and say, well, in all these areas, including health, what should we be shooting for in the world? And then I think you adjust the institutional rules accordingly to go with it. We can come back to that subject, but I'm very interested in saying, whatever are the issues of content and substance, how do we actually progress them at the global level and take them forward? The big shift being that what was once, not that long ago, a government or intergovernmental role became then a kind of mixed model, public-private partnership, celebrity alliance. And now I think we're seeing much more dependence as governments find health budgets much more difficult, and the emergence of emerging countries to be players where the private sector-led model, which is the industries that both Jerome and Petra are involved in, becomes interesting. But then you raise the question of how viable are they going forward, given you need global R&D and global innovation. Who pays for that, who benefits, is a really interesting question. So thanks, that's to start.